Greetings, this is Dr. Carlson, and this video section is on the subject of content marketing. Our learning objectives are to understand the role of content marketing strategy within your overall marketing efforts, to be familiar with the steps involved in developing a content marketing strategy, as well as the steps for developing your content itself. We'll also recognize some of the models for understanding how types of content are absorbed or experienced by your target audience. So what is content marketing? Well, according to the Content Marketing Institute, it's a strategic marketing approach focused on creating and distributing valuable, relevant, and consistent content to attract and retain a clearly defined audience and ultimately to drive profitable customer action. Now, this is matching content of information, inspiration, or entertainment to your customer needs at whatever stage they are in the buying cycle or along the customer journey. It's also a strategic component of integrated marketing communications because of the consistent content marketing applies to all the spaces in which you share content, whether that's traditional or digital. And because the focus is on engaging content, which means that marketers must think like publishers to attract an audience rather than seeing themselves as advertisers simply buying an audience to a product. So let's take a look at Halverson's model for content marketing. It's got four basic components to it. There are two of which are content and two are people-oriented. So on the content side, who are you trying to reach and why? And where is your content? How's it organized? How do people find your content? How is it managed on a day-to-day basis for access by your target audience? The people side is internal to the company. That is, what happens to create the content within your organization? What's the workflow associated with it? And how do we set policies and guidelines and standards that our brand operates in, and how that does influence the content that is developed? So let's take a look at what's the role of content marketing. Let's start with who are we and why are we here? This really starts basically with things like the corporate or the strategic business unit purpose, our brand essence, the architecture we've decided to employ for our brand, how do we position it in the marketplace, and what's our basic value proposition. That's about us, but it's also how we present ourselves to the world and the values that we are projecting. And who do we serve is the next question. What are our customer wants and needs? And how do we target and segment the portions of the market for that where we can fulfill the customer wants and needs? And last but not least, how do we understand our customer in terms of their market persona? Third element is how we're going to communicate. Now, there are a lot of different ways to communicate, and we'll cover some in more detail during this video, but let's just start with the basics. We communicate through basic information about our company, and that is also often projected through our advertising and promotional efforts. But there's more behind the scenes. White papers, reviews, referrals, testimonials, all of those are how we communicate our value to our target customer. So in order to effectively understand our customer, we can talk about it on an individual basis. We can even come up with specific stories about specific customers. But the marketing persona helps us group them more into categories and segments that we can direct our efforts to. So creating those marketing personas addresses at least 5 basic things about our customer. What kind of tasks are they trying to complete, and what questions do they need answered? How does the user feel about the experience that they're having and what really matters to them and what influences their feelings and perceptions and ideas? In other words, people, things, and places that may influence how they act. Then let's deal with the overall goal. What is their ultimate goal? What are they trying to achieve? And what are the pain points that may be impeding or providing some kind of negative experience to their journey? So those are key elements that go into the development of any marketing persona to understand that particular target segment of our audience. So for content marketing, let's take a look at what kind of structure that we need to have in place. We need to be able to create content, and good examples being press releases, infographics, other kinds of information about our company and our product and its value. How do we amplify that through paid advertising, images, reputation management, and other ways in which we project this content? And finally, how do we curate this or manage this process over time through video marketing all the way through to event marketing, content partnership with others, as well as hopefully promoting some positive viral marketing efforts? Now here's a different idea. This is looking at the problem from a taxonomy perspective. That is, what about the person? We've talked about the persona, and we've also opened the topic of pain when putting those personas together. So how do we segment this audience? How do we deal with them and their pain points and unmet needs? Then there's the process that overlays this in terms of the content and the journey that the customer goes through, and how can we trigger responses through events, promotion, other kinds of targeting activity. So that's the taxonomy: person, pain, and process in which we address the person and their pain point. In order to accomplish our objective, we must build engaging content. So let's look at a process for actually creating that content. First, let's look at what kind of research is necessary to understand both our market's wants and needs, but also the kinds of issues that are present. And what are the industry trends that are being uncovered here to understand how the rest of the industry is trying to address this target market. Now, this is not to imitate, but to differentiate. Now, let's create some leads through gated content and other kinds of triggers, and create some form of visual multimedia content. But we also want content that will always look to be fresh. It isn't just brand new, but it is fresh, but is always there and being updated. Things like white papers and testimonials. And let's engage in content-based community building. In other words, there needs to be conversation here. Blogs are a good place for this kind of activity. And we build those links through outreach tactics and relationship building. Become known as the expert in your field. And where you need to, execute a content repackaging strategy. In other words, using your videos to create a podcast, to create a channel, those kinds of ways in which we can recycle and freshen our content in its various forms. But in order to accomplish any one of these elements, let's take a look at what the Content Marketing Institute has to say. There should be some kind of workflow. Now, this does not necessarily mean that you have to have a very large staff, but rather understand the role that is associated at each step or level of this workflow. What is the strategic positioning? What kind of issue are we trying to address? That's where we create the brief. Then we need to sit down and actually write about it. Yes, we need to write about it. And even if you're going to produce a video, what's the script, what's the event, what's the sequence that we want to do? And we can create static images, dynamic images, or video in this design to put a visual aspect to our message. But let's also make sure that we get some subject matter expert review. That is very important, particularly if you're trying to address an issue and you're doing it from the standpoint of positioning yourself as an expert view of the topic. Better have those subject matter expert inputs. Now that says what you might have created in the beginning goes through a number of revisions in order to accomplish the objective. Then we will put this into our content management system. And yes, there are software packages and components of enterprise packages to manage your content. And let's review this before we ever set it into publication mode. Make sure there's a solid review, even things like checking for spelling. A final approval from the subject matter expert. We'll actually try it out in a test mode, see what kind of reaction we get. We may have to make some adjustments there before we finally publish it for broad distribution. Now, we need to also think about the structure and content of our message based upon the kind of appeal we're trying to make. What kind of emotional appeal are we doing? Is it to entertain? Is it to educate? Is it to be persuasive? Or is it to inspire your response from your target market? So there are different kinds of forms of content that we can have that reach into each one of these different quadrants. If we're talking about emotional awareness, maybe there's branded video, some competition, something that gets people engaged in what is the idea from an entertainment perspective. The inspiration side of this may be anything from a community forum or reviews from others who may be inspiring in terms of how they have gained value from the product or service. And celebrity endorsements also have a strong value here. Now, on the rational side of things, if we're trying to educate, then there's articles, there's press releases, there are white papers, all of those kinds of things. And the convincing side of this moves to forms of testimonials in terms of case studies and webinars. But we can also provide data sheets, price sheets, various kind of ratings, even evaluation criteria that helps people through the decision process. So in this discussion, we've looked at content components, that kind of substance that we have. Who are we and what are we trying to reach and what is our content and how's it organized? But we also have talked through the steps of a workflow. And while we have not addressed specifics, standards to be adopted, any organization needs to have a brand guide and a set of standards of how the brand and the company is presented in public. So let's quickly review. In this lesson, we've talked about the role of content marketing strategy and its role and place in your overall marketing efforts. We've talked about the steps involved in developing your strategy and your content specifically. And we've recognized some models when we talked about the elements of the reason for persuasion here, or types of content, and how they're absorbed. Is it rational? Is it emotional? Is it meant to convince? Is it meant to engage from an entertainment perspective? All those elements come into place when we're talking about how your content is experienced by your target audience.